Hi, this is Sue Jackson of the Book by Book blog, and I'm here with my November reading wrap-up. Running a little late because there is so much going on with the holidays, always behind this time of year, but I wanted to tell you about all the great books that I read in November. Now, most of November for me was focused on Nonfiction November, so I had a lot of great nonfiction books in a variety of different kinds of types and genres. So my first book of the month, though, was fiction, a book that I was reading for my book group, Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. So I really like Maggie O'Farrell. I've read one of her novels before for a different book group, The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox. And I loved that book, as did everybody else in the book group. So I was looking forward to reading this. Besides that, I've been listening for the last year to everyone I know just raving about how great Hamnet was. And it won the 2020 Women's Prize for Fiction. So that says a lot right there. I think my expectations may have been too high. I enjoyed it, don't get me wrong. It was a great book. I liked it. I didn't fall in love with it like so many of my friends and fellow readers have. And that may, again, just be because my expectations were so high. That happens sometimes. But anyway, Hamnet is a novel about Shakespeare's son, whose name really was Hamnet. So in the novel, the father, Shakespeare, is never actually named, but you know that's who it is. He and his wife, Agnes, have a daughter, Susanna, and then twins, Hamnet and Judith. And in the novel, as the novel opens, so this isn't a spoiler, Judith is very sick. And even though they live next door to his grandparents, Hamnet can't find anyone at home to help. It says right in the first pages that Judith has big buboes in her neck and under her arms. So this is close to 1600. You know what's going on here. So that's right from the start. So in that early chapter, Hamnet's running all over town, looking for the members of his family, his older sister, his mother, his grandparents, anyone that could help. His dad is in London because by that time he's become a playwright and an actor. So that's where it starts. Now the chapters go back and forth in time between the past and the present as Hamnet's trying to find some help for Judith. Interestingly, and most of the people in my book group agreed with this, we thought the book probably should have been named Agnes. Of course, that wouldn't have the connection with Shakespeare's famous play, but it is mostly about Shakespeare's wife, Agnes, which wasn't her real name in real life, and about Hamnet's mother, Hamnet and Judith's mother. So it goes back to her when she was a young adult, when she first met Shakespeare, and their courtship and then marriage and the children, etc. There's also a lot about Shakespeare's earlier life and his struggles with his father, who was an alcoholic and was violent. So it was an excellent book. Everybody loved it. I think my expectations were a little high, but you should definitely read it if you haven't yet. And then I dove into Nonfiction November. So my first nonfiction audio book for the month was An Elegant Defense, The Extraordinary New Science of the Immune System, A Tale in 4 Lives by Matt Richtel. So as you can probably tell from the title, from the subtitle, this is a book about the immune system, but told through the experiences of 4 different people. I really loved this book. It was absolutely fascinating. I learned a lot. Now, I happen to have an immune disorder that not a lot is known about. So it was doubly interesting to me, but I think it will be interesting and helpful for anyone in the world, because we all have an immune system. And the immune system's kind of like the immune system in the brain, I suppose, the last bastions of medical science, the last frontiers where researchers still don't fully understand precisely how it works, and more importantly, how to, with the immune system, how to adjust it. So the 4 case studies that he talks about. Oh, and importantly, the author is not a scientist or a doctor. He's a reporter. He got interested in the immune system when an old friend of his got a very serious stage 4 cancer and was trying immunotherapy. So that's how he got into this, with a personal interest. And he looked at it as a reporter. So the book is written for lay people, by a lay person. The immune system's incredibly complex, but he makes it easy to understand. So the 4 case studies he looks at is his friend with cancer, a man who got AIDS in the 80s but survived and is still living, a happy life. And then 2 different people with different kinds of autoimmune disease. And in each of these cases, he looks into, what's going on behind the scenes with the immune system and what doctors can do to treat those. My only disappointment with the book was that he did not have any easy answers for me, as I already knew. Like I said, doctors don't yet know how to adjust the immune system. They know how to turn it off. They know how to turn it on. They don't really know how to fine-tune it and normalize it, which is what I'm after, and lots and lots and lots of other people. So, fascinating book. I highly recommend it. An Elegant Defense by Matt Richtel. I also read No Cure for Being Human by Kate Bowler, and the subtitle is And Other Truths I Need to Hear. So Kate is my favorite podcaster. She does a podcast called Everything Happens, and the logo for her podcast has Everything Happens for a Reason with For a Reason crossed off. So this is who she is, and this is what this book is about. It's about kind of debunking some of the positivity myths that we have in our society. That you can get well if you just think positive thoughts and eat nutritious foods. And, so Kate herself is living with stage 4 cancer. She has successfully gone through a lot of different horrible treatments and surgeries, and she's been through a lot, but she's still alive. She's still there for her husband and her son. And so she comes at her podcast and her books from this perspective of someone living with not only chronic illness, but this constant shadow of what might happen in the future. Now that probably sounds depressing to you, but that's the best thing about Kate. Every time I listen to a podcast episode, and certainly reading this book as well, she makes me laugh out loud. She is totally honest, very authentic, raw, and very, very funny. She tells it like it is. So much of this book is about her journey with her cancer and what she has learned and how she has debunked some of these myths in our society. At the end of the book, there's a table, cliches we hear and truths we need, where she counters kind of the cliches. And believe me, as someone living with chronic illness, I've heard plenty of these. And but counters those with the truth we really need to hear, the honest truth about being human. So, things like, well, here's her sense of humor. So things people say, carpe diem, a more complicated truth. I mean, yes, unless you need a nap, which I can totally relate to. Things people say, everything happens for a reason. A more complicated truth, we must learn to face uncertainty with courage. So she is, and I know some of you don't like this, but I have dog-eared almost every page in the book because she is constantly saying things that reach me, that I just feel like she's talking directly to me. She understands what real life is like. So I highly recommend both the podcast, Everything Happens, and her latest book, which I just heard was number 6 on Amazon's all-time bestsellers. Not all time, but all the bestsellers right now, not in a certain category. So I'm really happy it's selling that well because it's a wonderful book. No Cure for Being Human and Other Truths I Need to Hear by Kate Bowler. Next up, I read another memoir, but a very different sort of memoir, Crying in Hmart by Michelle Zauner. So this is kind of coming of age, the story of a mother-daughter relationship, and also the story of how the author coped after her mother died of cancer. Okay, so there are some similarities to the last book, but... and much of it has to do with getting in touch with her Korean ancestry. Michelle was actually born in Korea to an American father and a Korean mother. So she and her mom took many trips to Korea when she was growing up. She grew up with the food, and as an adult, she begins to realize what all that means to her. And after her mother dies, reconnecting with her food, with the food and the culture of Korea, are ways for her to kind of come back to life and cope with her loss, but also start living again. It's a wonderful book. It also is both moving and powerful, very raw and honest, but sometimes funny as well. She talks about her rocky adolescence and how she and her mom didn't get along for a while, which I think a lot of us can relate to, the rocky adolescence part. It's really, and this is another book that I've just heard about everywhere this past year, also at the top of the bestseller list. And there's a reason why. It's an excellent memoir. Crying in Hmart by Michelle Zauner. My next audiobook for Nonfiction November was one that really blew me away. It's called The Sisters of Auschwitz, the true story of 2 Jewish sisters' resistance in the heart of Nazi territory. I forgot to write down the name of the author. Her first name's Roxanne, but it'll be in the picture that I put up to go with this. So, sometimes I feel like I've heard all the World War II stories. I've read so many books, both fiction and nonfiction, about the Holocaust, about people surviving, about people dying, about ordinary people and what they lived with. But this book was really powerful. This book did teach me something new about the Holocaust. So these 2 sisters, 2 Jewish sisters, and as adults, they both married non-Jewish men. So they had to go into hiding when the Nazis invaded the Netherlands where they lived. So they were Dutch, and they had to go into hiding. And at first they were, like many people, kind of, hiding in a hidden area of someone's home. And then eventually they found this huge home out in the woods because of their husbands, they were able to legally rent it from the two elderly sisters who owned it. It was completely secluded in the woods. It was an enormous house. So they moved in with their families and their children, and their parents, but also both of the daughters, both of the sisters had been involved in the arts before the war. One as a dancer and one with visual art. So they also made this home a refuge for artists. They called it the Nest, and so much of the book is about what takes place at the Nest. There are actually 3 parts. The beginning of the war and when they first had to go into hiding, after they moved into the Nest and what happens there, and then they were eventually captured and taken to a couple of different camps. In fact, these 2 sisters were in the same camps as the Frank family and in the same dorms, if you want to call them that, in the camps with Anne and her sister Margot Frank. So that part's fascinating as well. But there's something about this book that is just so raw and powerful. What these women went through, the bravery, the courage, and not to give out any spoilers, but in case you're worried about it, they do survive. So that helps a little bit. But for some reason, this book just hit me even more than other stories of the Holocaust that I've read. So highly recommended. Very, very good historical nonfiction. So that's The Sisters of Auschwitz, the true story of 2 Jewish sisters' resistance in the heart of Nazi territory. It was busy in November because of Thanksgiving, but I did squeeze in a graphic novel. This is Other Boys by Damien Alexander, and it fit for Nonfiction November because it's actually a graphic memoir. It's the author's story of, I'm trying to think, I think it's 7th grade? Yeah, it's the author's story of his year in 7th grade. So he had felt for a long time like he didn't fit in, like he wasn't like other boys. And he talks about, well, first, his mother was killed violently when he was very young. His father's not around. And so he and his brother are being brought up by their grandparents, who are very kind and loving. And when he was much younger, he was quite happy because his grandparents kind of let him be him. So he loved to play with dolls. He liked pretty things. And, and he had a lot of dolls as a young boy. But as he started to grow older, and especially after he went to school, he started finding out that this wasn't acceptable. That, his peers would make fun of him. He even lost his friends because in the early grades, he was friends with 3 girls. And the 4 of them were like best friends and did everything together and hung out, on the playground at school. But then, they got to a certain age and someone said to the girls, he can't be your friend, he's a boy. The whole boy-girl thing started. And he found himself even without any friends. So he was bullied a lot. And this book is about his experience in 7th grade. He had just started at a new school. And he decided that the solution to the bullying was just not to talk. So he tries to go through 7th grade without talking. And as you might expect, this does not help his situation. But the book is also about how in that year he learned about himself and came to accept himself, in part with the help of a therapist. So it's a wonderful, wonderful, moving story. It's funny, it's warm, wonderful, full color pictures that I really enjoyed. Just gorgeous glossy pages filled with full color pictures. There he's talking about his family. There's some scenes from school when he's younger. So he kind of flashes back a bit and talks about when he's younger too. That's him during that 7th grade year. So very good book. Graphic memoir called Other Boys by Damien Alexander. Now, I spent much of the second half of November reading one book because, again, Thanksgiving, we actually made 2 trips to Western New York, the first for a funeral and then again a week later for Thanksgiving. So that was a lot of time in the car. I can't read in the car. And a lot of time staying in people's houses and being exhausted and just not being able to read much. So I mostly was reading during that time, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, One Woman's Obsessive Search for the Golden State Killer by Michelle McNamara. So this is true crime, but it's also memoir. It's an interesting combination because it's as much a story of the author as it is about the serial killer that she became obsessed with. So briefly, she had a true crime website. She did some writing. And she began to follow one discussion topic on her website about this rapist and murderer in California who had terrorized the state in the 70s and 80s. So Michelle became really, the subtitle says it, really obsessed with this whole case with the killer. Once DNA science came around in around the 2000s, this guy got away with it for so long because he kept moving. And the different police departments, were each running their own investigation and not talking to each other, not even aware that the same thing was going on in other areas. So it wasn't until the 2000s when DNA science came around that both detectives and forensic investigators who could not forget this case began testing cold case evidence and finally realizing that all these different rapes and murders in the state of California in the 70s and 80s were all one guy. But they had no idea who that guy was. So this case really got under Michelle's skin. As it opens, it's a memoirish chapter about her, up in the middle of the night researching this serial killer in her daughter's playroom because she's just so obsessed with this and so much wants to find out who this guy is and make him pay for all the damage he did to so many people. So that's the basic premise. Now, Michelle actually died before she finished the book. She died suddenly. And so her editor, her assistant, and one of the main guys from her website, who was also helping to investigate this case, they helped to finish the book. So there's a foreword by author Gillian Flynn. There's a last chapter by her husband, who is actor Patton Oswalt. And the last part in particular was written by this team of other people who'd been working on it. Now, you don't find out until the appendix at the end, but I don't think it's a spoiler because this has been on HBO. I don't think it's a spoiler to say they did finally catch the killer, but unfortunately it was after Michelle's death. She never got to see, the end to her hard work. The people most involved in investigating the case, the officials most involved in investigating the case, did say that she played a significant role in it, both her investigations and the publicity she brought to the case. Now, of course, the politicians didn't give her any credit, but, those really involved said she played a big role in it. So fascinating on so many levels. It's true crime, so it's like a thriller, but it's also, this moving memoir of this woman who just became so obsessed with trying to find this horrible man. So I really enjoyed it. My son's girlfriend gave this to me for my birthday. She loves true crime. She knows I love to read, so this was kind of the perfect gift, and I really did enjoy it. It's on my husband's stack on the to-be-read bookcase now. I almost forgot that I did read one other audiobook, not nonfiction, during November. But like I said, we had those 2 very long car rides, and it was just my husband and I for most of it. So we haven't been on a road trip together more than like an hour or 2 away from home in like 2.5 years. And that's not just the pandemic, but also caring for my elderly father-in-law. So this was the first time we'd been on a long road trip. So I have a huge backlog of audiobooks for the 2 of us to listen to together. So I picked out one of those that I've been dying to read, 8 Perfect Murders by Peter Swanson. I've read Peter Swanson's novels before. He was one of the guest authors at Booktopia, a book-focused weekend in Vermont that I go to every year when it's held. It hasn't been the last couple of years. So I also got to meet the author. This novel is unique. So it's about a bookstore owner who has a blog for the bookstore. And years ago, he wrote this blog post called 8 Perfect Murders. And it was just like a roundup of 8 murders that occur in fiction that he thought were probably unsolvable in real life, that, were just so perfect that the police wouldn't solve them and someone could get away with them. So one day this FBI agent comes knocking on his door and she says, "Did you write this article?" And he says, "Yeah, years ago." And she said, "I think someone is using it to commit murders now." And he's like blown away by this. So he and the FBI agent start working together to look into these murders. Now, since they're each from different books, they are each entirely different, which is why no one else investigating any of the murders has put together that they're connected. But this one FBI agent found his article and started to see the connections. So the 2 of them start investigating. Now, this bookstore owner has a few secrets of his own that he really doesn't want the FBI agent to know. So those take a while to be revealed. Meanwhile, they're looking for this murderer who is basically copycatting all these famous murders from mystery novels. We loved it. It's a great book, lots of suspense, perfect for a long car ride. Our only complaint was that it basically ruined 8 novels that we'd like to read. So, in order to delve into this plot, you have to know what happens in those 8 murder mysteries that he wrote about. So the audiobook, the book does spoil 8 they're all sort of classics. So, chances are you've read or heard of most of them. But I had actually only read one that they talked about. And then they do bring a 9th in, which I had also read. But my husband hadn't read any of them. So we finished it and he was like, "Well, that was a great book, but now I can't read these other 9 books." So, but we enjoyed it, and it definitely was great for a long car trip. 8 Perfect Murders by Peter Swanson. And when we finally got back from our Thanksgiving trip and I finished I'll Be Gone in the Dark, I only had 2 days left of Nonfiction November, but I managed to squeeze in a small one. I read Lyft by Kelly Corrigan. Now, I've wanted to read Kelly Corrigan for a long time. I've heard her on several podcasts being interviewed, including Kate Bowler's Everything Happens podcast. That was the most recent time that that I heard Kelly Corrigan, and that made me request some of her books for my birthday this summer. So my son gave me this one. This is, as you can see, very brief. It's written as a letter to her daughters, who are young right now. And so the idea is that someday when they're older, they would read this. So it's about their childhoods, but mostly it's about the experience of being a parent. And she actually pulls three very different parenting experiences into it. Her own experience when one of her daughters as a baby caught meningitis and had to be hospitalized. And, it was real touch and go for a few days. So there's that. But she also talks about the loss of a member of her family, a boy who was only, I think, 18, her aunt's son, which I think would make him some sort of cousin to her. But she talks about her aunt's experience of losing her son and grieving, and also, the impact it had on her as a family member. And finally, she talks about a friend of hers who has always wanted to have a baby, but she's in her 40s now. She's never really found the right person and settled down. And, she has to make a decision about what she really wants out of life. So all of that is packed into this small volume. As with Kate Bowler's book, I tabbed several pages. Here's just a quick excerpt to give you an idea. Kelly writes a lot of personal essays, and that's what I knew her for. This is kind of like a long personal essay. But here she's talking about her father, who her kids call Greenie, for grandpa, I guess. She says, Greenie has this huge family, and I love being inside something that big. I love the noise and hugging and high-fiving and how we tell the same 10 stories every time we're together. And after that, we tell the same six jokes. So, I had just come back from Thanksgiving, first time seeing my family in 2.5 years. I could really relate to that. And I'm a parent, so there's a lot I could relate to here. So that's Lyft by Kelly Corrigan. So that's what I read in November. I would love to hear what you read in November. What was your favorite book or favorite books? Tell me about it in the comments down below. And while you're at it, like the video, and if you'd like to see more, just click the subscribe button.